occupation, German occupation, but also to use culture as a way of communication and exchange between countries. And this has remained the core of the mission for the Danish Cultural Institute, that is to use art and culture as an important way of exchange and cooperation between countries, where we see some challenges on a political level. So you could actually say that art and culture serve as an extended arm of politics. So where political cooperation ends, art and culture can actually take over that dialogue and cooperation between countries. So currently the Danish Cultural Institute has institutions in 6 countries. That is in China, Brazil, India, in Riga, covering the 3 Baltic states, and in Poland, which is now in the process of closing down, and then in St. Petersburg. So the institutes are present in countries where we do have cooperation on political level, but where we also see some challenges and limitations to that political cooperation, and where we at the same time see a possibility and a common interest for cooperation, people between people. So not on political levels, but people to people. This is where art and culture play a crucial role in continuing and expanding that cooperation and exchange among people. The Institute in St. Petersburg was established in 2003, and I became the director in January this year, when I moved here together with my husband Klaus, who you'll meet later, or you could probably see him now, and with our 2 girls, Anna and Vera, Anushka and Virushka. The institute here in St. Petersburg has a long tradition of exchange and cooperation between different artists, between musicians and authors, and so forth. So over the years, many Danish artists and musicians have visited Russia, but not just to perform their art and music or literature, but also to meet Russian colleagues, to meet a Russian audience. And this shows to be of great inspiration to most of those artists. When they meet a new audience, when they meet a new context, a new culture, thereby they actually develop in their own art and their own cultural projects. So this is not a one-street exchange of culture. It's on the contrary, it's a meeting between artists and between people, between cultures, where we learn to know each other in a different way. And we also want Danish people to know more about Russia, not from a political level. No, we have that covered in the media and through the politicians, but we want people to know each other on a different level and learn about each other and each other's culture. We find that there's a great interest from people both in Russia and in Denmark to actually learn more about each other, and also to get to be inspired by each other. From a first glance, you could say, and the way we are depicted in each other's media, there seems to be a lot of differences between Russia and Denmark. And there are a lot of differences, for sure. But there are also a lot of similarities and common interests and values between Russian and Danes. So Danish Cultural Institute works with those common interests that actually exists between Danes and Russians. And when we learn when we meet each other and share experiences, we can also challenge each other a bit. And that's where it becomes interesting, I think. So, for example, this year when we will have our Nordic Weeks Festival, which is a tradition on the 10th year, festival organized together with our Nordic colleagues. This year we will actually have a very special focus on green lifestyle and on sustainable development. Not just to have art projects, but also to have a dialogue on some certain topics and values like green lifestyle and sustainable development. And this is not just because it's a Nordic brand that we want to bring to Russia. It's actually because we have heard an interest from our Russian partners in this specific topic. So that's how we operate, actually, is very much listening to what is interesting to our Russian partners and to the Russian audience. And the same goes for another important project that we're working on. This is our waterfront project, Vodnaya Linia, which is done in cooperation with a Russian partner called Street Art Research Institute. This project works on engaging the local communities in developing areas around waterfronts. Many cities in the Nordic countries, they have experiences in developing such areas to become great places to live and to recreate and using, actually still preserving nature in these areas of the city where people live and enjoy life. So these experiences can be brought into a Russian context. But what is really crucial here is that the interests and the needs are defined by the local communities. What are they interested to learn in? How are they interested to develop their areas in the city? So this project is very locally driven. So the very core of the project is that we approach and invite for proposals and ideas for local initiatives to develop specific areas around the waterfront in and around St. Petersburg. And we also, the Institute also hopes that we can on a long term can develop a cooperation over borders on sustainable urban development. You might know that Copenhagen will be hosting the international conference on architecture in 2023, or you might not know, but this is a possibility to cooperate between Denmark and Russia in urban development. So we actually see a great potential for working on urban development in a Russian context. You see that urban development is, you could say that it's just architecture. What is that? What does that have to do with art and culture? But urban development is connected to so many things. It's connected to climate and green solutions. It's connected to food, local production. It's connected to how we live, how we experience, how we use our cities. So it's culture in a very, very broad sense. And I think that's important, that we don't work just with art projects, like in a more classical understanding of music and theater and so forth, and literature, but that we work with culture in a very broad sense, because we are all surrounded by culture, and that's how we live. So that's definitely the way how we operate as an institute. And then another interesting project when looking at getting to know each other as societies is the concept of trust, as you also mentioned, that we have this project on trust, doverие, which is also organized with together with a local partner, where we discuss the topic of trust and what does trust mean in society. We discuss that with young people and students in St. Petersburg. The purpose of this project, this joint project, is to discuss what the role of trust is in society. I said earlier that there are many similarities between Russians and Danes, which there are, but when it comes to the level of trust in our respective countries, we do see some clear differences between Denmark and Russia. In Danish society, trust plays a very crucial role. Danes are kind of raised to take responsibility for themselves, and on the other hand also to enjoy great personal freedom. But to enjoy that personal freedom, it's fundamental that we can rely on, or we can trust that our co-citizens, they take their share of responsibility. So that is a very like a core foundation of Danish society, like other Nordic countries. And that leads to a lot of freedom in many ways in our society. Trust is, of course, both when you talk about trust in government and trust in media, trust in your neighbor, or even trust in your family. And of course, there's a lot of historical reasons for the level of trust we experience in our different countries. And that is, I think that's important to discuss in both in a Russian context and in a Danish context. And I think it's clear that how this trust actually plays a role in this Corona crisis that we are all currently experiencing. When the Prime Minister in Denmark, they say that you should stay at home, then people stay at home. It's not just because we are a very obedient bunch of people, but we actually trust that the situation will be handled in the best possible way by our government. So I think to discuss this concept of trust over borders is very valuable for both sides involved. And I would say as long as there's an interest from the Russian side to discuss topics like trust or other important values, the Danish Cultural Institute is definitely going to be here to discuss and to cooperate on such issues, people between people. So that was sort of an invitation to work with the Institute if you have interesting topics or values to discuss or other interesting projects. So that was all for me.
Thank you so much for this inspiring talk. And I have a few questions for you. The first one is, what ideas and values do the Danes and Russian people share from your point of view?
Small accident. Yeah. I think there is, if we leave politics out of this, and I think that's important that we actually talk about the similarities people to people. I think there's a common love for enjoying a good life. Oh, really? I can see myself actually. Now I was just corrected by my husband because you can only see half of me. I can see the full picture. Really? But I can see the full. Can you see me properly?
Yeah.
Yes, we do.
Okay, they can see me. Okay. We're sitting in separate rooms in the same apartment, of course, and the kids in another third room. So that's right. I think when we start meeting, when I meet with people, and I think especially young people, actually, I think there's a tendency that there's a development within the younger generation to have a mindset that is more similar to what we are experiencing in Denmark. So focusing on values like nature, preserving nature, having a close relationship to nature, having normal rights to education, to equal rights between men and women. I see that also developing much more than when I experienced living in Russia like 20 years ago. There's a huge development in that field. But I would like to ask the question the other way around. If you can see some similarities also with the experience you have of Denmark, what sort of similarities do you see between young Russian people and young Danes?
Last year was the first time I visited Denmark myself, and it was a really enjoyable experience for me. And I was completely sure that I would love it because I started learning Danish language for this particular purpose to go to Denmark and to see how it is. And well, I believe that the thing that unites us is our general kindness and care about each other, because in Russia people are also very hospitable, and they really do care about their families and their children. And I believe that it is well, the main thing that unites us, our kindness and our care.
I think that was beautifully put. And also one thing that I think it's highlighted in many meetings between culture, but I think in this case between Danes and Russians, it is true that I think we also share a common sense of humor, that we find the same sort of things funny. At least that's my experience, maybe because I've been living in Russia for several times and have experience, but I find it very easy to joke with Russians and actually to have an interesting conversation where you can still joke about things that are maybe sort of serious, but it's allowed to joke about.
Yes, it is totally true, because when I was in Copenhagen, we had a teacher whose name was Ivan, but he was a Dane, and he always tended to joke about the American students that attended this course last year, and he always said that they blamed him for the lack of political correctness. And I believe that well, it is also a thing that unites us, because other nations believe that Russians and Danes lack of political correctness when they joke and when they speak about anything.
Yes.
But
yes,
we relate in this issue.
I agree.
I also have one question. Maybe you have noticed some differences between our mentalities, from Danish people on one side and Russian people from the other side, or Nordic people and Russian people. So we have spoken about our similarities, and what about differences between our peoples, if you have noticed such?
Again, I think there is a huge difference between the young generation and the older generation. I can't put something specific that I would say that we differ when we talk about the younger generation. Of course, there are the background and historical baggage that you would have, but when you talk about the older generation. There are many differences, and of course, it comes very much down to the historical development or the experiences that the older generation has gone through, in also in good ways. Again, taking this Corona crisis. Of course, it's serious and it should be taken seriously, and I think people do. But on the other hand, the Russian people are like, okay, this is one crisis out of many. We will survive that with no problem. In Denmark, people are panicking, it doesn't take a lot of challenges for Danish society to panic, In Russia, people stay calm because this is just a small period and we will live through that. So maybe that's one of the Russian people are really tough, I would say. They don't complain in the same way like Danes do in a crisis like that, for example. Maybe Klaus here, I'm sure he would have noticed some very interesting some observations on that also.
Definitely, I do, and actually I've been covering this Corona crisis from Russia. It's been very interesting to talk to Russians, because they were kind of we have been living through other crises which were way worse than this one. So we'll get through that also, and that is kind of a typical very positive way of living, I think, at least. But it's also very unique for Russians, from my perspective. And actually, when I'm going live to my network, I often actually tell the viewers that of course you cannot generalize and say that all Russians are thinking that way, but a lot of Russians, they actually think we'll get through this somehow, because we have had so many crises in our history, and this one is only, you know, a tiny one.
Спасибо большое. Спасибо, Хенриетта, за большой рассказ о деятельности Датского института и о подробном рассказе о международных проектах. Это было очень интересно. Сейчас можем передать слово Клаусу с вашим топиком про журналистику в России и доверие СМИ в Дании.
Thank you, and I will. I hope you don't get offended if I speak in English. That's way easier for me to do that, especially when it's it's about trust in media. Yeah. Okay. Well, as a professional journalist, I'm very proud of my, you know, the work that I'm doing, and I'm always trying to look, if I have a story, I want to report from all sides, at least try to be as objective as possible. But if you look at polls, you know, several polls in Denmark, unfortunately, they show that the trust in media in Denmark, it could actually be better. According to a recent poll, actually around half of the respondents, they said that they don't think that Danish media are objective when they are covering a story. And every time I see this, you know, all these polls, I actually get frustrated. Why is it that the Danes, they do not trust a guy like me? I mean, I'm actually I'm appalled, because actually, when I think of my friends who are, a lot of them are actually journalists and colleagues or other journalists that I know from Denmark, you can't trust them actually. So that's why I'm puzzled when I look at these polls, and all the polls actually. Of course, some of them they differ a lot, but well, not a lot actually. The overall sentiment is that people, especially in Denmark, they don't trust Danish media, and it also comes down to a lot of the tabloid newspapers in Denmark. I don't know, maybe to compare it with, I don't know, Komsomolskaya Pravda or whatever. I don't know whether you distinguish that as a tabloid newspaper, but we have, you know, some tabloid newspapers in Denmark, and they tend to kind of squeeze an angle which is kind of, well, it is true, but sometimes they make a scandal out of small things, which actually is destroying the overall picture on the way that Danes, they actually look on media, and the way that other journalists, they are covering stories in Denmark. And then also the emergence of social media outlets. Everyone can say that I'm a journalist. Everyone can put a story on Facebook or VK or wherever and say that I'm a journalist. And that has become, you know, very, very dangerous, because people, they unfortunately, they believe it sometimes. We have all heard about fake news in the United States, also fake news in Denmark. You know, people, they are trying to say that the coronavirus was actually a biological weapon created by the United States, which is, I don't know, where do people get these information from? And it kind of, you know, it ruins, it is destroying the right view on journalists, and which is, yeah, it's a pity. And actually, because of all these fake news stories, kids at school in Denmark, they're actually being taught how to be critical towards information. I have 2 daughters myself, and I'm trying to teach them not to believe everything that they read on social media, but they can definitely believe when they are, consuming kind of stories from bigger outlets in Denmark. I wouldn't say that they could, or they can trust, big medias in Russia or in the United States or wherever. At least in Denmark they can, because they are trustworthy, even though polls are showing the opposite. I also wanted to tell you about in Denmark we have this independent watchdog committee, which can actually reprimand media outlets. For instance, if I, as a journalist, if I say something wrong, this independent watchdog committee can actually require from my news outlet to apologize or say, okay, we were sorry, Klaus, he said something ridiculous, which was not true, and we are very sorry, actually. So that's an instrument that can be enforced, actually, if I, as a journalist, if I'm not conducting the way of being journalist in a right way. Then again, I mean, if we look at these stupid polls, I mean, I have to admit it, and I hate it, but people in Denmark, actually, they don't treat journalists as much as they should, because it is actually very unfair. And I don't know, maybe Henriette, she can correct me, but journalists, we have a long tradition of being unbiased. The education that we are going through in Denmark, I mean, the journalistic education is of high standards. We have had, of course, a lot, not a lot, but some incidents where journalists in Denmark, they have kind of destroyed the view on media and journalists. I can give you one example. For instance, it was a guy, he's a guy, and he was covering the war in Iraq, and he was a военный correspondent. How do you say that in English? Yeah, a war correspondent, a television war correspondent, and he was writing with some of the Danish soldiers. The story was about that now the Danish soldiers are leaving Iraq, and this is the last armored vehicle that is leaving Iraq. But the fact was actually that this car that he was sitting on was not leaving Iraq, it was actually entering Iraq. And that was, it created just a huge story in Denmark that, oh, look at this correspondent, he's lying. Can we trust him? And then, people, they started digging into other stories that he had made, and it turned out that he had, manipulated with a lot of things. He was fired, of course, because, a Danish media outlet cannot have a guy like him employed because he's not telling the truth. Because, journalists, they have to tell the truth, and they have to be, at least, they have to try to be unbiased. They have to gather information from all sides. Regarding myself and other people, other journalists that I know, they do it. I mean, when I'm reporting from Russia, I try to take information from one side, and then I also try to convey the message from the other side. I mean, to have both sides represented in my stories, I mean, that's essential. I've been working in Syria during the horrible war there, and I've been traveling around in all these areas in Aleppo, Homs, and wherever in Damascus. But I was invited by the regime, which means that I was invited by the Bashar al-Assad's side. So I was not on the opposite side. I couldn't get information from the opposite side. I mean, the rebels, as a lot of people, they are calling them, or terrorists or whatever. And that was, for me as a journalist, that was a struggle, because I could actually, when I was reporting from Syria, it was almost impossible to convey the message from the other side, from the rebel side. But I tried to do it. I tried to gather information on the internet, on Twitter, or wherever, and try to call sources that I might have on the other side. But I also, of course, conveyed the stance of the Bashar al-Assad side. It was difficult, but it's not impossible. And that's the core of being a journalist, to convey, as many sides as possible when you are covering a story. And that's a lot of Danish people, they think that we are not doing that. They think, at least according to the most recent poll, around half of the respondents, they think that Danish journalists, they are not objective when they are reporting, which means that the Danish viewers or readers, they think that we, or I as a journalist, I pick one side and then I only report that. And if I had the chance to tell all the Danish viewers and readers, no, it's not like that. I'm trying to put all sides in one story, and then you as a viewer and then you as a reader, you can then by yourself try to get out of it what's wrong and what's not right. Working as a journalist in Russia is also very difficult at times, but thankfully, I can watch Первый канал, which is reporting from one side, and then I can also watch news from media outlets which are kind of more critical towards the system. And then again, I as a journalist, if I'm reporting to the Danish audience, I have to take all sides. Stories which are positive towards the government, and also stories that are not positive towards the government. But I also have to go on the street and talk to ordinary Russians, which is the most important thing from my perspective, because I think that a lot of journalists or a lot of media coverage from Russia conducted by foreign correspondents is more or less or mostly focused on political stories. And I think, from my perspective, it's way more interesting to report about ordinary Russians. What do they think? So every time during this Corona crisis, when I'm with Henrietta and our daughters Anushka and Berusik, when we are in a small shop or wherever, I try to talk to people and get some information which I can use, because right now I cannot travel around because of the social distancing and stuff like that. So I'm kind of my hands, they are kind of tied together. So I'm gathering information from shopkeepers around here, and then I'm also gathering information, of course, from television. But I think that if just people, not journalists, media consumers, if just they knew what journalism really is about, and if they just would trust journalists more, then of course these polls that we have in Denmark, they would look more positive. But the fact is that unfortunately a lot of Danes, they actually do not trust media that much. They trust more, the established big medias like TV2 that I'm working for, and also other bigger networks, and the old established newspapers. They are fairly trusted, but smaller outlets, tabloid newspapers, they are not trusted that much. That's it. If you have any questions, please bring it on.
Thank you very much. I'm Hailan. So I'm wondering, what are yours most interesting let's say projects, themes which you have touched during your work in Russia. So, which things could you consider from both sides, from Russian, from Russian side, from Danish side, and if you can speak about them and give some examples, then I will appreciate it a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, as Heredity told you, we moved to Russia in January, and then we had to go back to Denmark in the beginning of March, and then we returned to Russia March 8th, I think, and then we went into lockdown.
Yeah.
So actually, I haven't had the chance to dig into very good stories, but I have, of course, a lot of stories on the paper. And one of the stories that I really want to do is in Siberia, in the taiga, the permafrost is slowly melting, and there is a small park in Siberia called the Pleistocene Park, where it's actually two scientists, a father and his son. They have created a park with a lot of animals, and they try to preserve the permafrost. It's an amazing story because it touches upon climate change and stuff like that, and it's not politically. So that's actually a story that I would love to do, and that would also create a lot of. I think a lot of Danish viewers, they would also love a story like that. But unfortunately, a lot of editors in Denmark, they really like, the political stories, listening about Putin, how evil he is and stuff like that. And I'm just, hey, Russia is more than that. We have our, differences. Russia is not Denmark and Denmark is not Russia. Of course, Henriette said that we have a lot of similarities, but let's be honest. I mean, it's even though the two countries are not that far away, physically, but mentally, I think it's very far away from each other. And maybe that's because of language and history and stuff like that. But I have this mission as a journalist, and I want to make this gap between Russia and Denmark. I want to make it more narrow. I want to show Danish people that Russia is not like the way that a lot of Danish people, they think that Russian people, they are evil because they are helping Bashar al-Assad in Syria. A lot of people, they drink all the time from dusk till dawn, and it's vodka everywhere. All these stereotypic stories. Let's get rid of it. Let's leave it, because it's getting boring. Let's have some new stories. Let's focus on the Russian people.
So you could say that we are on a joint mission here in each our field. So we actually, Klaus and I, from different perspectives, work on some of the same goals. That is for people, the Russians and the Danes, to get another picture of each other, and working on the level where I work, where it's not politics either. It's another level. It's about people to people cooperation and learning about each other. And honestly, the media has not been a big help in this so far. Now we have Klaus, so it might change completely. Let's hope that with the picture that we have of Russia in Denmark, and it's right that it's only on the politics that we have this stereotype image of Russia, and not a lot of trust in Danish society of Russians. And of course, we would like to somehow, little by little, change that understanding of each other both ways, and get to learn each other on a different level. And again, this is not about Putin and politics; it's about the people living in Russia. So that's a joint mission that we're on here, apparently.
I'm glad that we agree.
Actually, someone posted a question I could see in the chat, asking what led us to Russia. I think somehow was the question. I can brief as brief as possible. So we actually, Klaus and I met 20 years ago in Moscow, actually, both coming from Denmark, but both studying in Moscow. So we actually we met there, Moskovskaya Lubov. So when leaving Russia, we've been together since then, and then after that we've been living several times in Russia and Russian-speaking countries. So we were living in Murmansk, for example. We lived in Georgia, Tbilisi. We lived near the Aral Sea in Kazakhstan. Not Russia at all, to make that clear, but the language at least we could somehow use that. So this is the first time that we live in St. Petersburg, which is an absolutely joy for us also to experience that. Of course, we will always have Moscow as the place where we met, so that is close to our hearts also. But for the first time, bringing our family here, so that's of course a great experience. And maybe they would see a different picture of Russia than they wouldn't have seen had we stayed in Denmark. So yeah, very briefly.
I see that Zina Dedova, she has a question for me, and which is a very good question. She asks, what's the biggest struggle Russian journalists they have to face? Of course, I'm not a Russian journalist, but I would think that one of the biggest struggles that they are facing every day is meddling. I mean, it's meddling from government or owners of a newspaper. Just influential people, they are always trying to meddle in journalism, which is a no-go from my perspective. For instance, in Denmark, which is a healthy democracy, Russia is also a democracy. I didn't say that, but Denmark is we have a long tradition that, of course, owners of media outlets, they should not meddle in the way that journalists they are work. It's just a no-go. And I would, if for instance, if my boss, he told me, okay, you cannot touch this story, you have to make another story, the angle was not right and stuff like that, I would leave it. I would leave my post and I would just say, okay, it's not a work that I would do. But it would not happen, because that would create a huge scandal in Denmark if a newspaper owner required from his subordinates to cover a certain story with a certain angle. That's just a no-go, and that must be very, very hard for Russian journalists, because I know that is actually happening here, unfortunately. Because if the true media, true journalists, they have to be critical towards the people who are having power in society. That's governments, that's big companies, everyone. Journalists, they have to be independent, and if they are not independent, then you cannot trust it. It's kind of basic, actually. So I kind of think that must be the biggest struggle that Russian journalists they are facing. And it's not only journalists from the state-owned media, it's also journalists from the other side, from opposition side, because they are also under pressure to find certain stories, to create a certain angle and not to be objective. There are some media outlets actually in Russia who are objective, which is true journalism from my perspective. But stories just covered from one side, that's actually not journalism from my point of view.
thanks for answering these questions. I think Victorina, you have one.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to express my gratitude for your speech because, I am working for a Scandinavian club news service, and we also publish a weekly coverage of the events that took place in Nordic countries. And I've always noticed one big difference between Russian press and the Danish one, because when you read, for example, DRDGO, you see a lot of viewpoints on the same situation, while in Russian media it can be an official stance of the government or the personal view of the journalist himself. So I'd like to ask you, have you heard of an incident that took place at Russian media outlet called Ведомости?
I do, yes.
So what is your opinion about it, and what solutions can be found to this probably, well, if we can call it crisis?
Yeah, well, it's now I'm talking as a private person, and of course I think it's sad that I mean, I have forgotten his name, the new owner of Ведомости, but it's clearly that when he said, okay, you cannot cover, for example, critical stories about Rosneft and the CEO of Rosneft. We cannot have stories in our newspaper about Levada, and I would just, why? Because now you're just destroying, independent journalism. Because from my perspective, Ведомости was one of the few newspapers in Russia which actually tried at least to be unbiased, just convey information to the people of Russia, because they need that. Let people by themselves analyze what's wrong and what's not wrong, and what's true and what's not true. As a journalist, you don't have to tell what to think or what to do or whatever. You just have to convey, observe and tell what you as a journalist you saw yesterday. Media consumers, they should decide themselves whether to believe a certain story. I hope you get me, and that's the problem when this owner, the new owner of Ведомости, he had these requirements. It kind of ruined everything. But I don't know, the journalists at Ведомости, they did publish a poll from Levada, even though that he said that they were not going to do that. So thank God for some of the independent journalists at Ведомости, that they at least they try to continue the work that the good work that they have been doing. But as Russians, what do you think about it?
Well, I share your views on journalist ethics, because it is really important to be as objective as possible when you cover some events. I am bitterly disappointed in our official press, for example, our TV channels like России, and all of these people trying to propagate some ideas, trying to impose them on us. It is really dreadful for me, I really hope that these journalists who used to work for Ведомости, they would never be silenced. They would continue to speak their they will continue to write what is true, and I do wish everything well. Everything well. I wish the best for them. Well, what else can I say? Well, I had some idea, but it totally went out of my mind.
Can I add something, maybe?
Yeah, sure thing.
And it seems that we would probably easily agree in this forum that it's a big problem how journalism works. You mentioned России, or could be Первый канал or something, that it's easier for us to see that it's not really journalism. Of course, the problem is that a lot of people, not in the big cities, but in the regions, maybe that's the only channel of information that they have. So if you hear that, even though you somehow, maybe even people know that this is not really journalism, or they wouldn't call it, they know it's tailored information with a political purpose behind it. But if you hear that every day, at some level you start to believe it, or that's the only reality that you actually see. So of course you sort of support those ideas eventually. A lot of people would do that. But of course, luckily, there's also a development in the media that a lot of people have access to online information, and it's much more difficult to actually, for government or for other structures to sort of influence or limit those sources of information that you can find online. So Russian people, especially young people, and of course people in the cities where you have more access to all sort of sources of information, that might change the media sector in Russian, as it has in all countries, of course. But then another challenge comes up, because if you have access to all of this information, as Klaus mentioned, you cannot trust all information that you find online or even in some media. So now we need to actually teach our children and young people how to assess the information that they have available. This is again something in Denmark that people are. I think one of the comments were also that it's a natural thing for many young people in Denmark and older generations even to assess the information they get. They are critical towards their sources and the purpose of that specific information. It's not exactly something that is built into the public school system yet in Denmark. It is a process, and we are, as Klaus mentioned, he's trying to teach our girls also to be critical to what they access, and that of course will also be important in a Russian context, to educate through the school system children and young people how to be critical towards what they read. So that's also something that the Cultural Institute, of course, will have an interest in working in, to assisting or a changing experience between countries. How do we address this challenge with the new media situation that we face?
Thank you so much for expressing this point, and I'd like to add that a huge positive development took place due to Corona crisis, because there were a lot of propaganda and a lot of fake news on this issue, and it even became possible for elder generation that is particularly vulnerable to this propaganda to think critically and not to believe everything as it is presented in the media. For example, my parents, they were very convinced advocates of Russia 1 and Russia 24, and it was a reason for a lot of arguments in our family. But now they told me that they would never believe everything they see again, because, well, they actually managed to see that the reality is a lot, differs a lot from what is told. So I believe that some crises are necessary to to make a revolution in people's minds and to make them understand what they didn't.
Well, yeah, if our listeners don't have other questions, then I'd like to express. Yeah, Klaus?
Yes, I didn't get all of what Ekaterina she was saying because of bad connection, but I think I got kind of the overall picture of what she was saying, and I completely agree with her because you know, in a crisis like this, which is, you know, striking all of Russia. I mean, you cannot kind of contain this crisis to a certain area. If you could that, then of course, as a government, as a state, you could spin whatever story that you want. But because of the corona crisis is just striking, it's touching, you know, all corners of Russia, then you cannot hide the information. Even though that you are trying, you cannot hide it because it's affecting a lot of people. And when a lot of people are getting affected by something, they will speak out, especially in a time like this where you have access to internet, you have access to social media, and which is very good because then people, they can see, okay, wow, I can watch on Первый or Viesti or whatever they are called, that they are saying this, but on my phone, on VK, I know that from a relative which is living in Dagestan, for instance, in Makhachkala, I see that a lot of doctors, they are dying there. But the official numbers which are presented on Первый are low. But how come that my relative in Dagestan, they are telling me that at least 50 doctors are dying or are dead because of the corona crisis? It's yeah, I know that this corona crisis is very negative and it's very bad and stuff like that, but hopefully it would kind of create, you know, a certain another view on media. Maybe, hopefully, Russians, they will become more critical towards, you know, information that are being spread out in state-sponsored media, but also in opposition-sponsored media, because the opposition media is like the same as the state-sponsored media, because it's biased, and we have to get unbiased stories from Russia to the Russian people, from my perspective.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So as far as I can see, we don't have any questions, and I would definitely like to thank you, Henrietta, and you, Klaus, for this extremely informative meeting, which I hope has an impact on all of us. You're incredible guests, and I think, and I'd like to invite you to our one of our events, this forum, Northern Dialogue, which we will hold, as soon as possible. We think spring 2021. This is a platform where youngsters from Nordic countries and youngsters from Russia can communicate between each other, and where they can also communicate with the experts on different level. So this platform, which we definitely like to hold. We did once, and we will do this one more time. we will also definitely love to invite you to all our other meetings, and as speakers and as guests. I think this all for today. Thanks to you. Thanks to Ekaterina and to Andrea also. Without you, this meeting could not be possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It sounds
Thank
very
you.
interesting with the platform. Looking forward to hear more about that later also, and also an invitation to all of you. If you come by St. Petersburg, please find us. The door is always open at the institute for anyone interested. So,
thank you.
Great meeting you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Igor, and thank you very much, Ekaterina, for organizing this meeting. And I think we should also invite all our speakers for Friday's meeting with our trainees and some of the trainees from the Danish embassy in Moscow. It should be a really interesting meeting, I think, of Danes from two different towns, St. Petersburg and Moscow. So you're very welcome to join us this Friday at the same time, 4:30, right here.
Yeah. Thank you for remaining, Andre. And this is all for today. We'll meet on Friday also.
See you on Friday.
See you on Friday.
Thank you very
See you
much.
Friday.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Спасибо большое.
Спасибо.
Bye.
Mange tak. Vi ses på fredag.